welcome to today's panel, In and Out of School, Learning to Make an Impact. My name is Archika Dogra, and I'm going to be today's moderator, and I'm joined by two incredible panelists, Kekashan Basu, founder of Greenhope Foundation, and Amit Sharma, Assistant Director at Dream a Dream Foundation. Today's discussion is going to be really exciting because a lot of educational discourse is centered around what happens inside of the classroom. But today, we're going to be exploring it through a slightly different lens. How does inequity and opportunity outside of the classroom impact students from diverse backgrounds and society as a whole? So before we begin, we would love for you guys to engage with the panelists here during this intimate roundtable discussion. So feel free to use the WISE platform and WISE application to send in any questions you have throughout the panel, and hopefully we'll get to yours through our discussion here. So today I want to allow the panelists to take a chance to introduce themselves. We're all here working on different projects, particularly in the nonprofit and education space for out-of-school learning. So let's start with Kekashan Basu of Greenhope Foundation.
Sure. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Kekasha. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I am a United Nations Human Rights Champion, a Forbes 30 Under 30, and the youngest trustee of the Parliament of the World's Religions. But most importantly, I am the founder president of Greenhope Foundation, which is a global social innovation enterprise working across 25 countries with over 225,000 people through education for sustainable development, using that as a transformative tool to provide them with the knowledge, skills, behaviors required to think and act for a sustainable future. And for that, I was awarded the 2016 International Children's Peace Prize and this year's World Literacy Award. And our work at Greenhope Foundation is all about ensuring that no one is left behind and that we recognize how important it is to understand local challenges and thereafter implement local solutions. So localizing the sustainable development goals and really making sure that education is recognized as the basic human right that every single person needs. So intersectional, holistic education for all. And I'd be happy to talk more about the work throughout this panel.
Awesome. I'm really looking forward to hearing about it. You're so young and you've done so much, and I'm sure you're such an inspiration for so many people. We have another inspiration here on the panel, Amit Sharma from Dream a Dream Foundation, joining us virtually from India. Take a moment just to introduce yourself and the work that you do over at Dream a Dream Foundation and otherwise.
Thank you, Archika, and thank you, Kekashan. It is an honor to be part of the conversation with both of you. My name is Amit. I work with Dream a Dream, where I head the North India operations along with the National Advocacy. I've been part of so many other mindset and behavioral change projects like Happiness Curriculum, which was awarded yesterday in WISE. Along with this, I also am working on a lot of national advocacy programs which are aligned with life skill and behavioral and mindset aspect. Along with this, I'm also working with some of the projects in other state governments which directly work on the social-emotional aspect of a child's development, along with how we can integrate life skills in the system structurally. My expertise lies working with the governments, helping put in a lot of designs which different organizations are working in, how they can be systematically integrated in the education system to solve the problem from top down and bottoms up way it works. So that's my expertise lies, and Dream as an organization is working for more than 20 years now on the space of life skills, social emotional learning, and 21st century skills, where we work with the students coming from underprivileged and adverse backgrounds to really work with them, provide them a space, a life skill-based approach to overcome the adversity and thrive in the classroom.
Yeah, Amit, give us 1 second. It's a little bit difficult to hear you right now. So I think the tech team will work on that. But we want to hear all the things that you're saying. So just give us one moment to try to figure that out and sort that out. But we were able to hear the first part of that. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think while they're sorting that out, we can kind of move into the first phase of discussion and also circle back to what you were just saying at the very end of that as we move on to our first phase of discussion. So I think the question that I want to pose is talking about the problem inherently of inequity in access to opportunity that students face outside of the classroom. So in the United States alone, there was a study that was done where there is a 6,000-hour learning gap among low-income students as opposed to their more affluent peers in terms of what opportunities they receive educationally outside of school. These are after-school programs, summer camps, etc. And that's a really large amount of time. In fact, that's like 3/4 of a year, basically. So the work that you guys are doing is very tangentially and directly related to those out-of-school learning opportunities. And so I think it would be a great place to start kind of breaking down the issue, especially because all three of us come from different education systems, Canada, India, the United States, and it would be kind of interesting to see how that manifests in different education systems and what those inequities look like. So Kekshan, if you want to start maybe talking about what you've noticed through the work that you've done, and then also personally in terms of these inequities, that would be awesome.
Yeah, well, first of all, our education systems in general are still steeped in colonial archetypes. So we still have this very Western way of teaching and of learning, and obviously that does not work for everyone, and it kind of puts forth this one-size-fits-all solution that actually exacerbates inequalities, including in our education system. So in our work, working across 25 countries and with so many different people, we understand how important localization is, and we still don't see that in mainstream education, and that is a very, very big problem. We are still very much focused on those Western places, even using English as a main medium of communication, and that kind of erases regional languages, traditional learnings. And, this kind of hegemonic way of teaching is just pushing those who are the farthest even further into the mire. So the first thing that we need to understand is that we need to adapt our education system, our curriculums to meet the needs of those who are on the ground, to really equip them with the required necessary skill sets in order to bring about positive change within their own zones of influence. So that is where we really need to go. And once we realize that, we need to move away from this Western hegemonic way of thinking, something that, also perpetrates misogyny and all of these other challenges, then I think we will be able to reduce inequalities in our education system, both education in school and out of school. And the last point I would make is that, we're still also always thinking about education as education just within the four walls of a classroom. And while that is extremely important, we also forget about lifelong learning and about education outside the classroom, which, if you see, is what so many traditional, local, and indigenous cultures propagate. So I think that is really, really important that we bring about that shift in mindset and thereafter, be able to reduce those inequities in our education systems.
No, yeah, that's a really great point about adapting these curriculums to these local mindsets. And what does access, or I guess more so the lack of access, look like for these marginalized communities or underrepresented and underserved communities, especially from what you've seen? Where do you see these disparities really playing out within the education systems that you're familiar with?
Well, yeah, obviously it's the marginalized, vulnerable communities from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, the women and girls, primarily those in least developed countries and small island developing states, primarily the global south, but also global south communities within the global north, the developed world. So these are the people who have been traditionally marginalized, and because of this kind of Western hegemonic way of thinking, that marginalization just amplifies even further. So yeah, and it's really sad that it's a very large portion of our world that is being left out when we're just using education as that lens, but it's still not brought into general discourse as yet. So once again, we need to bring about that change, and we need that change now.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess specifically regarding out-of-school learning, what kind of impact do you think in the long term does it have on students who have access to it in an appropriate and relevant way as opposed to don't? Like, do you see a difference between the possibilities or potential of students who get that outside of school learning, whereas their peers who may not have access to it face a different kind of landscape going ahead?
Well, yeah, for sure. And as I was saying, that, lifelong learning is something that is the basis of so many different non-Western cultures. And, that enables students and young people, children, to become empathetic, global, responsible citizens. And, as someone who started her work 14 years ago, when I was 7, I can definitely say that, growing up in a household where empathy for people and planet was something that was instilled in me, both in school and out of school, with my family and within my community, that kind of holistic understanding of the world and how we as responsible global citizens must bring about change in our own zones of influence. That kind of learning is crucial. And if we just restrict education to within the four walls of the classroom, then, we don't have that kind of learning that comes from different cultures, from different people, and that comes from everyday instances. So it's, education is something we can't restrict knowledge. That is something that even if we try, we can't do it. But now we must normalize how important both in and out of school learning is, and provide the proper infrastructures to facilitate that in every single part of the world.
Yeah, definitely. So looking at the Canadian education system in particular, what does out of school learning look like, and who has most access to that kind of learning?
Well, in my country, we are more fortunate in terms of, students being able to access out of school learning. And I'll talk more about this later, but as Greenhope Foundation, we are partners with several of the school boards there, including the Toronto District School Board. And that is where we facilitate that kind of outdoor learning that allows children and young people to really gain that insight from outside school. And we've, just before coming here, we had this trip to one of the turtle trauma hospitals and turtle conservation centers. And it was so amazing to see how engaged the children were in learning about something and creatures that are just magical, really, for them, and are extremely endangered in our province. But just understanding that their learning is not just within the classroom, but out of it as well. And it really enables them in turn to become empathetic global citizens. So yeah, there is still a lot of inequity we see all across the world, but we have seen progress, and definitely in Canada as well.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I also work in the nonprofit education space as well, and part of the programming that we do at my organization, Innovators, is working with students to bring technology and STEM-related opportunities to them. And during one of the workshops, the student said, "I don't have a computer at home. Like, this is one of the only times that I use it." And to think that, a mile down the road, the public school students there all have their own computers, but there's still students so close to them who have such a disparity in the lack of access to these opportunities and these learning opportunities more specifically, was kind of wild to see. And it really, I think, encapsulates this idea that there's a lot of work to be done, no matter what education system you're in, no matter how, developed of a country it is. Inequity is very persistent. And I think we have Amit back, hopefully. And so I don't know if you were able to hear what we were just previously talking about, but it was really breaking down this issue of inequity and out of school learning opportunities for students. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on what that has looked like specifically in the Indian education system, and what you've been seeing as you were going through that education system and now with the work that you do.
So thank you, Archika, and thank you, Kekashan. I think I've been able to hear you fairly what you've been discussed. So first of all, I just want to bring in your attention. Wherever you feel that I'm stuck, you can't hear me, please feel free to stop. First is, there are around 1 billion students who go to school across the globe, out of which 30% are in India. And majority of those 30%, which is 300 million, they are part of the government education system, which is which is not so great in the country, kind of structures we've been created. And majority of this 1 billion belongs to the third world countries, majorly from Africa and Indian and South Asian countries. Now, when you talk about the learning gaps from the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries, especially students who come from adversity, belongs to a background of violence, abuse, they've faced it, they've seen it in some way or another. This 6,000 hours which we're talking about becomes huge. We also need to make sure, we need to consider there's no research being done so far around this yet. First is impact on these learning gaps.
Okay, I think we might have lost Amit again, but he kind of, Amit, I think you're back. Sorry, impact on learning gaps. That's where we last heard you.
Yeah. So is it better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Great, thank you. Sorry for the patchy internet. So if you see, in the past 2 years, first, we all have realized the value of the digital learning spaces, especially through all these online platforms, Zoom, Teams, Meet. And now if you see this in the lens of adversity, people who could afford it, who could afford a computer, who could afford a smartphone, who could afford internet, they've been able to learn one way or another. And the students who could not afford it, especially students from these third world countries, which is the majority right now, they have completely lost 2 years of their learnings. So when after 2 years they will enter into the school, they will be assumed as per their age 2 years further. But in reality, they are way behind. So these 6,000 hours which we are talking about, the gap is wider than that. And we will realize that in the coming future, how deep and how bigger this gap is. And then we'll be facing much more bigger problems in the learning space, in the education space. Yeah. Thank you.
Definitely. I think COVID-19 has very much uprooted how conventional education has worked with in-person learning, and also exacerbated this gap through the lack of access to digital technologies that students from usually socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds face. So now that we've kind of broke down this issue, I think a really unique perspective that both of you have is that you're on the ground doing the work specifically related to out-of-school learning, and not just out-of-school learning, but in an impactful way that fosters global citizenship. So I think where I kind of want to start is, what approaches do your nonprofits take in terms of providing programming, out-of-school learning opportunities, etc., to students in need? And what impact have you seen from those approaches, and how have you kind of been measuring that? So maybe we'll start with Amit.
Thank you. So at Dream a Dream, we work on multifold approach in terms of supporting students using a life skill-based approach after school. So there are two major programs we run. One is an after-school program, which through which we reach out to the schools and students coming from these adverse backgrounds, these marginalized sections. We try and work with them through two approaches. One is an art-based program and another is a sports-based program. These programs are specifically designed to help integrate life skills and life skill-based approach in the life of a student. So we use a lot of art materials, a lot of sessions where students can really sit, reflect back on their journeys, understand emotions and express in the form of art. Apart from this, we also work with football as a medium to work with students to first channelize their energy, but also understand a lot of skills which are helpful for them to survive. Let's say communication through sports, collaboration, creativity, managing conflict, managing teams. So this is how we really work with them. This is one of the programs which we do. Apart from this, there's another program which really supports students to be more aware about their own self, their skills, but in the light of their own career and what kind of hobbies, passions they have, and how they can really make a career out of it. So we run two Career Connect centers in Bangalore, India, where we help we work with students using a life skill-based approach, but then we're also working help them to acquire some of the skills, which is basic computer skills, skills around English speaking, skills around how they can communicate better, how they can present better. But we all do it with the lens of life skill, which really helps them not only to go for the employment, but think of a bigger chunk their life as in a bigger span, and think it's a career. That how can they make a career out of it, and not only go for a short-term need-based job to earn some money. So these are two approaches which we have. We have a lot of case studies and case stories out of which their students, especially coming from adverse and violent backgrounds, and how these Career Connect centers and our life skill program have helped them shape their life better, and help them think in a bigger, like channelize their energies, but also with the skills they have acquired, they've been able to take better decisions about their life and for their own self and for the community.
And how long generally does a student participate in any of your programs for? It may vary based off of the program, but how long do you generally work with a given student?
The shortest is a 5-day camp, which we do with students. These are experiential camp, residential, where students go on a camp, and there's various activities being done for them, which are very reflective. So we usually use a design called Arc of Transformation, which helps them to first go through the arc, but their own journey, their own learning helps in arc form, where they go through a lot of reflective exercises. They do a lot of physical activities along with art-based activities, which makes them experience some of the changes which they expect and they desire from the society. So in a way, we really help them to experience a lot of emotions, a lot of collaboration, a lot of communication. And once they experience communication, once they experience collaboration, once they experience empathy, they try and incorporate in their own behavior, and that's the objective of these smaller camps which we do, and which can further go up to 2 years in a Career Connect center, and longer than that. There's no defined time in Career Connect center. We really support our young ones, but usually the age which we support is 23 years of age till a person can be connected with a Career Connect center.
Awesome. Yeah. Kaikishan, I want to move over to you now and hear a little bit about what Greenhope Foundation is doing specifically in terms of your approach to out-of-school learning and empowering students with this knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be showing some slides for this so you can get a better picture, literally, of the work that we do. At Greenhope Foundation, as I mentioned earlier, we are all about education for sustainable development. I started Greenhope Foundation when I was 12 years old, and right at the onset, I realized that children specifically were really left out of the sustainability dialogue, and that kind of was amplified by lack of access to education. So for us at Greenhope Foundation, we really seek to fill that gap where we bring in all three components of sustainability literacy, which are all about interactions, interconnectedness, and implications. And our academies are tailor-made workshops, conferences that are run by children and young people for children and young people, so that they're able, our students and our children and youth are able to look at other children and youth as role models. And that peer-to-peer learning model is extremely effective, both within the classroom and out of it. So for us, we've seen this model work extremely well in both urban and rural and marginalized communities, whether we're working in refugee camps or we're working with a school in Manhattan, for instance. And I mentioned earlier how our education systems usually follow the Western structure and use English as the main mode of communication. But for us, we understand how critical it is to move beyond that. So we use those creative modes of communication like music, art, dance, drama, sport, eco-fashion, and writing to spread awareness and, give children the option of choosing their preferred method of learning, because speaking at someone is not going to work for everyone, and so that is why we allow them to really pick that. So they pick the mode of learning they're most comfortable with, and that is where we see the best kind of impact. But at the same time, we also understand that education that's so critical, but most of the children we work with don't have the infrastructure in place that helps to facilitate learning. Forget out of school, even in school, they don't have anything literally to facilitate that. So for us, we've been using clean energy technology to enable access to education. We've distributed solar lamps across Nepal, the Sundarbans, the Run of Kutch in India, where for many of the children, it was the first time they actually had a source of light at night with that solar lamp. And now we are installing solar streetlights across Asia and Africa. So this right here is in Bangladesh. So that is to provide safe spaces for women and girls. So primarily in many of the communities, after completing their chores, they go to school in the evenings, but they couldn't do that before because it wasn't safe to go out at night. But these solar streetlights now allow them to have that safe space and the freedom to move about in the evenings. And combined with that, we've installed solar grids, so solar panels in homes, in schools, so that the learning is really powered by clean energy. And, it allows them, and that solar energy, allows them to continue their education all across and also be able to study for their exams at night. This right here is in Liberia, and our chapter head was telling us about how the children had to go outside, out of town, to find one streetlight in order to study, and how dangerous that was for them. So now even having that simple source of light powered by clean energy in their homes allows them to study in the evenings. And with our solar energy grids, we are powering computer literacy education and climate resilience education, because a lot of the communities we work in are severely impacted by climate change. So we just had our most recent class of computer literacy graduates, most of whom were girls. And that is so amazing for us to see, because it enables them, and especially the girls, to have the necessary skill sets to get good jobs. That in turn helps to uplift their communities. We've distributed solar cookers to women in rural communities and training them on how to use them. So this, for instance, these are migrant women workers in Western India, the deserts of India. And, we have seen how when they use the usual cookers, that is extremely harmful for their health and that of the children as well. And a lot of the time when they left their house early in the morning, the children went hungry till 4 or 5 p.m. because they couldn't cook themselves. So these solar cookers now enable them to keep the food in the morning. The children can, open it, have their lunch on time, and then, they go to our schools where they continue their education. So for us, we also saw during the pandemic how obviously children are forced to drop out of school, majority of them being girls. So we had to find a solution in order to continue literacy and learning. So these are our solar-powered mobile libraries that are now taking books directly to the doorstep of over 250,000 children across countries in Asia and Africa. And we also conduct reading corners in there, so our ambassadors actually help the children with their learning, with their homework, so that really no one is left behind. So as I speak, our members are taking out this mobile library in order to continue that kind of learning. And we don't just stop at children and youth over there. We also educate farmers, because obviously our food systems are intrinsically linked to sustainability. So our solar irrigation systems enable farmers to practice climate-smart agriculture, grow nutritious food, and also encourage young people to practice farming in agricultural communities. And it's just so wonderful to see the innovative solutions they come up with. We've built a sewing school for women and girls. This is right here is in Bangladesh, where during the pandemic, they now have an alternate source of income. So the women specifically are stitching masks, clothes, bags, and then they use that money to send their daughters to school, and that kind of circular economy model is extremely effective. And, we were talking earlier about the digital divide and how children don't have access to tech. So with our routers that are now powered by our solar grids, the children now have access to digital technology. And, even we were talking about outdoor learning and environmental literacy. So, we continue that with all of our programs. We've planted over 400,000 trees across the world, indigenous trees, fruit trees for communities, both urban and rural, most effective for them. I spoke earlier about how we work in the Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, but really we've planted over 7,000 mangroves from Kiribati to Suriname to Indonesia. And, we educate the local communities about why it's so important that they preserve their mangrove ecosystems, which some of you might be knowing are the best natural barrier against climate change-induced disasters. And we've seen during the pandemic how our Grow Your Own Food campaign has been extremely successful, whereby children are taught to grow nutritious food within their homes and schools. And it's led primarily by our children's board and our girls. So that's been absolutely amazing. And finally, we work on educating the educator. Now, when we talk about, educating students, that's critical, but if we don't educate our educators and the teachers, we are not going to be able to really bring about that shift in our education system. So that is where we focus as well. And through that, we partner with school boards all across the world, from Canada to UAE to Suriname, to really ensure that change and at the end of the day, creating a happier world for all, where no one is left behind, and using education as that, and education for sustainable development as that transformative tool.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that, because not only you guys talk the talk, but you also walk the walk, using sustainability to teach sustainable education. And I have so many questions, but one that I really want to ask is, how did you get this started and ultimately scale it to where it is today? Because right now you're in 25 different countries, but you started it, you said, when you were 12, and I'm sure at some point it started small. So when did you realize that what you're doing on a smaller scale worked, and how did you imagine scaling that up to where it is today?
For sure. So our scaling up model is all about localization, and we realized that very early on. So yes, I did start it when I was 12, and I already had 5 years of work on the ground before that, and I wanted to really use that kind of experience and expertise to help my fellow children at the time bring about change in their own zones of influence. And what we also saw was that we saw this gap, as I was talking about earlier, and that is where we came in. But honestly, it was just about us finding that gap in other parts of the world as well, and seeing how we could be that catalyst for change. And slowly and steadily, we were able to go to the places where our help was needed the most. So as I was talking about earlier, in places that didn't have access to electricity, didn't have the infrastructure, didn't have routers, but even in urban environments in developed countries, where we saw that despite children having that access to education, that privilege of being able to go to school, they still weren't taught about, taking care of people and planet. So that is where we came in. And yes, it has been a gradual process, and that is how we like it, because we want to create that long-term impact. It's not just about going into a community, telling them what to do, and then being done with it. It's about understanding what they're going through, how we can be that catalyst for change, and then providing them with that sense of self-empowerment to bring about that long-term change. So yeah, and I can very easily say we work in 193 countries and be done with that, but we say 25 countries and counting, because we want to create that impact and make sure that what we implement there stays for the long term, and that every single person is able to benefit from that. So yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And Amit, I kind of pose a similar question to you as well. So through your programming, I'm sure that scaling is one of the elements of, how do we bring this curriculum in an effective way to another school and another place? So how do you first measure student impact within your programming, if there's any sort of mechanism that you use? And how do you realize that, okay, this is a program that I think would work here, here, and here as well?
Thank you, Achika, and thank you, Kehkashan. I think first of all, it's amazing work, and some of the cues I will take from Kehkashan, how she explained her work. If you look, the kind of work she is doing, she's created a lot of customized design to solve the problem which exists in the system. But just imagine how many Kehkashans or how many Amits or how many Archikas you need to solve the problem which is deep rooted in the system. Now, coming back to the scale and the impact measures you talked about, so we have multiple tools through which we really assess and understand the impact of the work which we are doing. First is an LSAS, which is a life skill assessment scale through which we understand that how much impact our programs are making on a young person's life. And we see this over a period of time, and then we try and understand what changes it need and how this can be translated into systems. Apart from this, we've also done multiple independent surveys. Let's say for happiness curriculum, we've done a Brookings study to understand how this curriculum is making impact in a student's life. And then we found like there are a lot of relationship kind of issues which they used to have earlier. This curriculum have actually addressed it. And it has actually addressed further the classroom of happiness. And they've carried it to their maths class and science class, where the students who used to be quiet in the classroom now asking questions in a math class and science class because they got an exposure in a happiness class. So we've done multiple studies to understand the impact of the program which we are doing. To scale it up, we are partnering with state governments in India, along with the national team, the national education agencies in India, to integrate the education, which is life skill based, social-emotional learning based, and more experiential in the system itself. So when a teacher goes in the classroom, while they're teaching a maths class or a science class, how they can use a life skill based approach to integrate it. And then you don't need a separate life skill based classes like this curriculum, which is integrated so that they can see in light of a maths and light of the science, that how can they use it to implement better when they go back in the community and when they're not in the school, in the classroom, and even in the school, in the classroom when they're interacting with their peers. And now my invitation here is just to solve the problem. And the question I would want to ask Kishan again back to you also, then how can we as individuals who are just creating success stories in smaller pockets solve this problem systematically? Are we equipped enough? Do we have enough resources? Do we have enough people who can actually come and solve this problem once and for all?
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect segue into kind of the next course of discussion. How do we institute systemic change and basically field solutions for a bigger picture? We're all working on these organizations that have our impact in different pockets and areas, but how do we ensure that this is happening maybe in countries that we can't reach, maybe in regions that we're not aware about? And what does that look like on a partnership level? Is out of school learning the burden of schools, which are now in this day and age so much more than just this 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. sort of area where students go and learn? They're community centers of sorts, or is there a partnership that's most effective or powerful that you've seen in the way that both of you have run your organizations? I can start maybe a little bit with what Innovators does in its approach, and it's really about working and identifying schools in low-income areas and community resource centers, etc., and going directly to them where the students already are and bringing that curriculum to them. It's really difficult to ask students to come to you. So ultimately how we do it is that we integrate our programming across anywhere from 6 months to 4 years to work with the very same students to build long-term impact through interdisciplinary programming such as empathy, ethics, leadership, storytelling, along with science, technology, engineering, and math. And when you become a consistent part of their life and you show up every week, you show up at least once every single month to educate them and provide them with that framework of learning, you create a much larger impact, I think, than a one-off workshop and other sorts of programming. So that's one effective systemic way of approach, like consistent learning and basically creating a place that is home for them to go outside of school and learn in a way that is engaging and fascinating for them as well. But I'm also curious to see throughout both of your work as to how that systemic change outside of just your nonprofit, but maybe based off of the learnings you've had within your nonprofit, could possibly look like.
Well, I think we forget how much power an individual has to bring about change, and that from the individual we move on to the collective, and from that collective we bring about that global change. So I think that we really need to start focusing on, letting every single person know that, yes, they have that potential to become a change maker, and then kind of providing them with the skill sets to move that from just a latent change maker aspect to something that they are able to implement on a daily basis in their lives. So that is where we at Greenhope Foundation have seen in all of our work that how powerful an individual can be, whether that's a child or a young person or an adult. And for us, I was talking earlier also, how long-term it's so important. And we've seen firsthand that, providing people with a sense of self-empowerment, providing them with the necessary skill sets, and meeting their unique needs is really the best way forward. And that ensures long-term security. In Suriname, for instance, which is the world's most forested country, we've worked with orphanages there. And, after we engaged with them, and, we continue to engage with them, the girls of that orphanage now run a pilot no plastic program in their school and in their orphanage. And that has spread in that community as well. We have seen how that has been replicated in other parts of the world as well. But the most important thing I would say in order to really bring about change and systemic change is localization. I think for too long we have been focusing on this one-size-fits-all policy, and that is just not going to work. We need to understand those local challenges, and as individuals, yes, we can do that. And just continuing the work, I think that's really important. The other point I would say is that it's also really easy for people to just say that, what I'm doing is so small. What kind of impact is that going to have? But I can say for sure that every small act counts. And if we just put all those acts together, we will be able to see systemic and global change. So just going with that is crucial. And I would also say that, we focus a lot on problems and just looking at the problems. We don't focus enough on the solutions and what is being done, what can be done. So I think using that solutions-based approach is also really critical. At all of these conferences and so many others, I hear a lot of people just focusing on what the problem is, but we know that there are all of these problems. We still don't talk enough about solutions. So I think that's another very important way that we can adopt that kind of optimism in order to bring about change and bring about positive energy. And I think that can really help. We've seen that help in all of our work across the world.
Definitely. And you mentioned equipping change makers, and that's something that clearly you do at Greenhope Foundation by allowing youth to teach other youth, as you noted when you were talking about your work. So what does that look like? How do you equip these change makers to go out and create change in their community? What kinds of resources do you provide them? Whatever mentorship, funding, etc. Like, what does that look like within your organization?
Yeah, again, it depends. I cannot sit here and say that, we just do this in total and that's it. And this is this necessary skill or this necessary tool that works for everyone. I can't say that. Again, it is about meeting their needs. And it can be as simple as providing them with a safe space. So for instance, in some of the villages that we work in, a lot of the girls didn't used to go to school because they didn't feel safe doing that. They had threats of, they faced sexual harassment, they faced threats of assault, and a lot of the time that arose from the fact that there were no toilets for girls in the schools there. So we built toilets in those places for the girls. And now we've seen that the girls feel safe going to school. And then we provide them with the resilience education in the school. In other parts of the world, it is equipping them, as I was talking about, the computer literacy. We saw how, that was something that they needed over there that would help them to get jobs, but they didn't because they came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they didn't have access to that. So that is where we came in to provide them with the skills. It really, really depends. And anyone who says that this is the global solution for it is lying. Yeah. Absolutely. That is where I just reiterate how important that localization is. And I can give many more specific examples, but just working to understand that community's challenge and that person's challenges is where we're where we need the change and where we will be able to see true change happen.
Definitely. And Amit, curious about your thoughts as well. What is your idea, or what are your perspectives on what potential solutions on a systemic level looks like, especially working in a NGO sector where I'm sure you have to partner with other educational institutions and the government, et cetera. What has worked and what hasn't worked?
Thank you, Ashika. And so I'm again referring back to what Kekacha is saying. So first, I completely agree. Each and every individual house, no matter how small it is, the need matters. My invitation here is to whenever, even if it's a small model, we need to think from a systemic lens. Otherwise, we are just feeding into the problem, we are not solving it. Even if I work in, let's say, one school, but if I think from a systemic lens that whatever learnings I have from that one school, how that learning will be translated into an entire education system, which might be in a state or in a country or in the world, how that will look like. And if I go back with that learning and feed it back in the system, it can create much more impact in this entire system. I'll give you an example, classic example of Dream as an organization. We have been very satisfied working with a very small number of teachers and students in Bangalore for around 18 years. We were working with 10,000 students. We were making good impact. And we have transformed so many lives through this program. Then we realized that the problem is growing on a much faster pace. If we really, really want to solve the problem, how are we using the learning from working with these 10,000 students and feed it back to the system? And that's how we've entered into the happiness curriculum, which was launched in Delhi, and then further took it to Uttarakhand as an Anandam curriculum. Just an example, within those 3 years, we've been able to reach out to 1.2 million students. The 1.2 million students, every day they do a mindfulness session. They do a lot of team building, collaboration, and creative activities. They hear a lot of stories which helps them to live.
Okay, I think we may have lost Amit once again, but we do have some interesting questions coming from the audience, and I think, Kekashan, this really is relevant to what you were talking about. So one of the audience members says that as a teacher, I also want to organize outdoor activities, but it comes down to budgets and non-priorities within schools. What would you tell their school leader to make this a priority within their school?
Well, I think that, we work with so many school boards across the world and even individual schools and teachers. And the best thing to look at is how the students and the children benefit from outdoor learning. And, even we've seen that sometimes we launch a pilot project, and based off of that, the board, the head teachers get more convinced that, okay, this is benefiting the students. And I think that is really how we bring about that kind of change. And just maybe taking that extra step in order to bring about the change is not going to be easy. I mean, if you're within a system that doesn't allow for something like that to happen, you do need to take that extra step and step up and take that action. And it might seem daunting, but it does work. And yes, of course, I think funding in terms of putting the money towards where it's needed, that is a huge problem that we still face all across the world. And that includes us at Greenhope Foundation, because people still have the mindset that it's not lucrative to invest in something like that, in outdoor learning and holistic intersectional learning. But I think what we've seen in our experience, slowly and steadily, we can bring about that change. And it really is sometimes up to a student or a teacher or just a person to just take that extra step themselves and then see where it goes from there. So I hope that answers the person's question.
Yeah, definitely. And Greenhope Foundation has already done so much, and I'm sure this is going to be a project that you're going to be working on in the future. So my question to you is, where do you want Greenhope Foundation to be in 5-10 years in terms of the impact that it makes? Perhaps whether that's scale, whether that's developing some sort of initiative that you guys haven't worked on yet, anything along those lines.
Well, my ultimate goal for Greenhope Foundation is, our ultimate goal is so that every single person adopts sustainable living as a way of life. And I don't mean that tokenistically. I mean that every single person shows empathy for people and planet through every single action that they take. Now, of course, that is a very long-term goal, but I believe that is possible because we've seen that firsthand on the ground. But for us, it is just about continuing the work that we're doing, ensuring that we are able to reach out to the communities that need us to be the catalyst the most, and finding those unique challenges that are still not reflected in our data and just going from there. So yeah, just, we've seen how ground level work, how localizing has worked, and we seek to continue that. And now with the pandemic, there are so many different challenges that have arisen. I was speaking about some of them, but there are so many more. And I think that this is a continuous process. It never stops. We just have to keep finding those challenges where they arise and then putting our teams out there to work to solve them.
Yeah, and do you think the pandemic changed the perspective of educators, administrators, et cetera, on sustainable and outdoor learning? Have you noticed some sort of shift in how important they find it, or how they see it integrating into their curriculum or the way that they educate their students?
Yeah, for sure. I think that the pandemic has really shown everyone how important it is to really address our inequities all across the world. Now, we've seen on one hand, that, a lot of systems want to bring about that change, want to incorporate sustainability learning. And on the other hand, they think that, they just need to focus their resources on something else, just solving the health crisis. But what they don't understand is that sustainability also includes solving our health crisis, solving the issues that are there all across the world. And it's such a broad umbrella term really for all of our world's challenges. So yes, we have seen progress. I think in Canada, there's, we have seen the government taking a lot of steps in order to ensure better learning. And of course, NGOs such as us continuing our work. But in other parts of the world, sadly, we have not been able to see that. And that's where we come in to continue to address that problem.
Yeah, definitely. And Amit, now that I think you're back, so we were just talking about the pandemic and the impact that it may have on how educational institutions, governments, et cetera, see the importance of out-of-school learning and that disparity. So what have you noticed during your work during the pandemic? And we're not quite after the pandemic as Omicron comes back up, but as we almost started to approach schools opening back up, what were the key takeaways that they had about out-of-school learning?
So first of all, I'll be really honest. First of all, we don't know the impact of pandemic on the learning so far, and there are no way we'll be able to know that actually how severe it is for next coming few years. First of all, I'll just give you an example. In Delhi, which is the most urbanized area in India, when we were doing our online projects, our penetration rate was 30%, which was so low. Just imagine if we do the same work in Uttarakhand, which is a 60% remote area, there the penetration rate is even below 10%. So just imagine the majority of the students for past 2 years have not learned at all. And if these students are at a very important learning developmental milestone where they learn languages, where they pick a language pretty fast at around 6 or 3 or 7, 8 years, they have actually missed out on so much important milestones of their learning, their schooling, and their peer learning, because their parents were coming from a very poor, marginalized background. They were leaving very early. Some of the examples Kekisha has already given. They're leaving very early to buy vegetables, to get job, to earn money for the family, and they're coming late in the house. So there's no primary person who can actually help a student to learn better during that time. So these are the fundamental problems, and there's no way we can actually understand how severe it is. But we know that there is a huge gap which is being created, and we will face that in the next coming 3 or 4 or 5 years. But how can we prepare right now for it? How can we integrate an approach which helps a student first personally to identify? It can be a generic approach, but how it can actually help each an individual to customize those learnings which they have through this system to overcome those challenges that they are facing. And this can be an approach which is more of a life skill based, how you give the skills, how you give power back to a student or a young one to make their own decisions.
in the light of empathy, that how they first understand how living in harmony with their own self, with their society, with their nature looks like. First, they experience it, and then they are making decisions which is more eco-friendly, as Kekisha is doing. But it also helps them to overcome the challenges and the gaps they've been facing when they were growing up. So how we can design a system, and this can only be done. There are so many good stories like Dreamer Dream, like Kekisha is doing. There are so many people working in silos where there are such amazing stories, such amazing success stories. How can we influence systems to adopt? How can we customize those for system? How can we really make it more contextual for system where this can be integrated and then given to each and every student who's going through that system? So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. With that said, we are running out of time, but I do want to say that I think one of the main takeaways of this panel isn't just whether students are having access to out-of-school learning, but what that learning looks like and how they access it, whether that's through empathy education, sustainable education, learning about community service and global citizenship. I think both Amit and Kekishan really, their work embodies that sort of intersectionality and that framework as to how we learn in relation to the world around us. So thank you both so much for being on the panel today. We have a long ways to go when it comes to inequity and out-of-school learning, but you both are really crucial in terms of finding those solutions and implementing them on the ground. Thank you everyone for joining us today on our panel, In and Out of School, Learning to Make an Impact.
Thank you, Chika. Thank you, everyone.